everyone, I'm John Lynn, the founder and chief editor at Healthcare IT Today. We're excited to bring you another in our series of interviews with top leaders in health IT. And our guest today is Weitnauer. She's Chief Product Officer at MRO. Welcome, Mo.
Thanks for having me, John.
Yeah, good to have you back. We've had you a couple different times, actually.
Yeah, always fun to be here.
Yeah, I always love learning from you. We're excited to be here at the AHIMA conference, and I want to learn more about some of the things that are happening. But before we go there, tell us about yourself and MRO.
Sure. Mo Weitnauer. I'm the Chief Product Officer at MRO, and my job is to talk to clients, see what's going on in the market, and help us develop products. And MRO, we're a company all about accelerating clinical data exchange across the entire healthcare ecosystem.
Yeah. Well, when you talk about that clinical data exchange and then healthcare in general, it's one of the most highly regulated areas of healthcare. How do you approach kind of reconciling, which sometimes is a competing requirements of these government regulations, CARES Act, interoperability, HIPAA, how do you kind of reconcile that at a high level?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, as you said, healthcare is a really highly regulated, for a good reason, because health information is of high value and of importance to patients in particular. I think there's I think of the rules and all the regulation as sort of kind of a tale of two cities. So there's one side that's really focused on access and expanding access, making things easier. We love that side. There's also the side that is about security and ensuring that only minimum necessary information is exchanged. We love that side too. The challenge is that those two can sometimes feel like competing concepts, because if I'm just trying to get the information out there, having to think about security and privacy and ensuring minimum necessary can be difficult for a lot of organizations. But that's why we're here at MRO. That's why you have a whole industry of companies that really try to reconcile those two worlds, accelerating exchange while ensuring that we're doing it in a compliant way.
I mean, I think you're bringing up such an interesting point, which is, we see this in the security side, right? You want it incredibly easy to use and secure. And often those are at odds, right? Well, the same thing. We want the data where it needs to be for the patient to make their life easier, to make their care better. But we also want the minimum necessary shared because we don't want to share it with the wrong people. That is kind of a tough challenge to overcome. Is it about the experience that's associated, or what's the key to balancing those two?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, we have to remember why we're in healthcare. Healthcare is about patient care. We care about patients and really stewarding the information correctly. So I think if we kind of take all those things as secondary, those other things like those rules and everything as sort of secondary, and still remember, right, at the end of the day, we are the caretakers of this very important information. So how do we do that? I think some of the regulations really are make it much more difficult and much more nuanced. It's not just about having information flowing through HIEs or QHINs or all these organizations, because at the end of the day, we still have to make sure that the information that's flowing is the right information to the right people. I like to personalize this issue and say, when I go to my doctor, right, and I go from the room where you're kind of filling out the orange tablet, the forms, or if it's paper, and then I go into the room and the nurse asks me the same questions, I get really irritated. So we want to make sure that we minimize that repeated information over and over and over. However, if, for example, I have substance use disorder, and I don't want my information shared with, say, my payer or a lawyer that I'm working with on a case, I want to make sure that the right information goes from the front desk to the nurse, but I don't want the information to go out to folks that don't need to have it, that part of the information that I find sensitive and I want to retain.
Sure. I mean, I think that's the challenge, because I think most patients expect that the data is already being shared with their care team.
Yes.
And then often it's not. And so then they're like, wait, what's going on here? But there is abuse, right? lawyers, as an example, in some cases have taken that data and used it to kind of ambulance chase, if you will. So it's an interesting balance. How are organizations, you work with a lot of them, how are they managing all the data and requirements today? And talk to us about some of the time, resources, and the data complexity challenges that they're facing.
Sure. I will say a lot of organizations are struggling, particularly providers. If you think about providers, they have so many demands on them of different types of requesters with different requirements, and now they have to bear in mind all these rules and all this regulation. So one of the things that I would say is clinical data exchange is a team sport. A lot of health systems, you're seeing IT, for example, really coming into play to try to solve this through technology. We love that, great. However, the field of health information management considers not just the access, but we have to know the rules and include compliance in the mix, legal in the mix, managed care, the contracts with the payer in the mix, and really balance all those demands, which makes it a lot more complex, which makes it you have to actually have specialists in this stuff, not just, a tech company that comes in and they say, oh, we can solve everything through tech. Well, have you thought about the state rules, right? Every single state has its own rules about who can you charge, what data can you share, what can you charge per page. I mean, things like those that a healthcare organization has to think about. I'll say I haven't met anybody who said, oh, I've figured it all out. I know exactly what to do.
Right?
It keeps changing, yeah. The constant thing in healthcare is change. Slow change, but change nonetheless.
The regulations, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think that is the challenge, especially as organizations get larger. They're multi-state now, and each state has different requirements, and the EHRs often don't support that type of nuanced sharing of data. In fact, a lot of people that don't understand this problem are like, well, can't we just give open access to EHR? And sure, patients should have access to their data. I think we all agree with that.
Absolutely.
But, it doesn't solve a lot of the problems I think that you're seeing. Can you talk to us about that? Are there some examples of times where open access to the EHR for the patient to be able to get in and get access to the data doesn't actually solve the challenges that are faced by provider organizations?
Yeah, so there's sometimes where you have good intentions, but things still go wrong, and bad intentions, and obviously things go wrong. So I'll give you two examples. So we did a study with Chime this year where we surveyed a lot of healthcare leaders on their challenges with clinical data exchange. And we learned that over 60% of healthcare leaders say the provider is providing open access to data to payers through portals or logins and things like those. And that's happening. It's part of healthcare. However, the challenge with that is when you have that open access to the EMR, one is payers have a lot of different interests as well. So, good interest, risk adjustment, we know the data is going to go out there, quality improvement, prior auth, we love all of that, that's important. However, a lot of times payers are using the data for claim adjudication, payment, overpayment recovery. So not having full control and visibility to what's going on to that payer access can actually harm the provider's bottom line sometimes. We're seeing this a lot with open access, where the provider, their quality programs are doing much better. However, they start to see their clinical denials go up.
Oh, interesting.
It's not magical. It happens. So that's kind of, that's why we say, yes, we're here to expand clinical data access, but you want to make sure that you're doing it right. I'll give you another example, and this is the bad guys. And I don't want to paint all insurers with the same broad brush, but there are companies out there where they take patient authorizations and they masquerade. So it's a lawyer who's requesting a medical record, and they're masquerading as providers, or patients rather. And you end up where they're getting the data, but they're pretending that they're patients. And so we treat them with a white glove service because we think that they're a patient.
Right.
But on the other side is a paralegal who's an ambulance chasing, paralegal trying to get the data. I get it, you're trying to do your job.
Sure.
But that's got to be regulated. Somebody's got to do something about that because it's a real harm. Those law firms, there's rules about how they should get the data. They should not be masquerading as patients. That's just get the patient authorization.
Yeah.
Don't pretend that you're a patient when you're not.
Yeah. No, I think that's a big deal. And, I think that was brought to light with some of the recent cases that have been happening, especially in data exchange. So I think we'll see that play out in an interesting way. As you talk to organizations, what do organizations get wrong when they're aggregating the data?
Yes, one of the things about aggregating data, everybody has some kind of clinical data warehouse where they're trying to aggregate the data. I'll say that in addition to issues of privacy and security and such is ensuring high data quality.
Okay.
So that when you're aggregating the data, there's kind of simple things that are actually can be a little bit complex, like mastering the data. That means that I know John Lynn in my database is John Lynn, not Joanna Lynn,
Identity
not
management.
identity management. So that we're exchanging the right data. Not even that, ensuring that in a clinical record, sometimes you might have commingling of records. So page 1 through 5 is John Lynn, and then page 6 there's somebody else in there.
Oh, really?
So we got to make sure that some of those things are really put in place. I'd say the other thing is we're a tech-enabled services company. We use technology. We love technology. However, in healthcare, it's been proven technology is not sufficient. There are things that technology does wrong that you got to add in services. You got to bring in the experts who know what they're doing. Not just assume, hey, I'll open up my payer portal and get all, all the data out there. There are issues such as what you saw with the particle and Epic issue where, somebody's using the data for secondary use. It's allowed, but that was not the original intent. And that's where all these nuances, tech alone is not going to be able to solve them.
Yeah. And you're right about the merging of data across patients. One time, when I was working in a medical practice, we would do an import of all the data because it was a student health center. So we knew every student, but it ended up creating duplicates, and we had to merge the duplicates. And usually it was pretty good. Name, birthday,
Yes.
we were able to do it pretty effectively. One time I merged two. Turns out they had the same name, the same birthday. And I'm like, oh crap.
No.
Like it felt so awful, right? Like, especially because EHRs don't allow you to delete stuff really, right? And so it became a whole issue, right? Where you're like, what do we even do with this, right?
Exactly. And then you have data from two different people.
Yep.
You end up with, the downstream provider making clinical decisions based on that data. And that's why it matters. At the end of the day, we do not want to interrupt or mess up patient care.
Exactly. And luckily I caught it so we could fix it. But many times as you're aggregating data, you don't realize it's happening until the doctor goes in and says, wait, why is this? This
Wait
doesn't
a minute,
make sense.
yeah.
Or the patient's like, I never had high blood pressure. What do you mean?
Exactly. And God forbid the doc prescribes the wrong medication based on the information, and then you end up with a much bigger problem.
So what else have you learned, at MRO doing aggregation for organizations? Are there some lessons you've learned doing aggregation for them?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say very simple is it's not that easy. So,
you're going to simply say it's not easy.
I'm simply going to say it's not as easy as it
Makes
looks.
sense.
It takes expertise. There are some areas in healthcare that are just so nuanced. I'll give you an example. So there's a new rule that came out, the reproductive health rule. The bureaucrats in Washington, good intentions. We want to protect the integrity of people's privacy, reproductive health. We don't want people's information to be used in the wrong way. However, there are things in there, for example, that says you need to go back to the person who requested the record and ask them to sign, as an example, or ask them specific questions to validate what they're asking for.
Okay.
Well, sometimes this information, the request, comes to us as a fax with a signature, an illegible signature of some judge in some lower court who's requesting a medical record, who am I gonna call? It's a signature on a fax. There's nobody to call.
There's no contact info.
I mean, they might say the contact info to deliver the record, but there is no back and forth. Am I gonna call a judge and ask him, like, do you really, really need this information?
Yeah, I
That's
don't think judges answer phones either. But.
No, and that's sort of an extreme case of the nuances of this stuff. And I would say the other thing is, one thing that we've done as part of our service with our providers is we bring in our privacy officer. He will come in and sit eyeball to eyeball with a privacy officer of a different healthcare organization, let's say a provider, and really advise them on how to think about these rules. We don't tell them what to do, that's on them.
Sure.
However, we're here to provide our expertise, our interpretation of the rule. We try to stay ahead of all the different state rules across all the use cases and the federal rules, and really kind of help them suss out, like, what does this actually mean for you? You can then develop your practices, your policies in-house. However, we're there to support you in how to manage these rules.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're embedded in so many healthcare organizations doing their release of information. It makes sense why you would have this nice broad view that they probably don't have, and don't have the experience. So I'm sure they love having your expertise since you've done so much of this sharing. That's interesting. You talk, though, about kind of, and, we kind of alluded to it earlier, how do you balance sharing with protection? Do you have some best practices for providers and even payers about finding that balance between, making sure the data gets shared appropriately and legally, right? There's legal issues if you don't share it in a certain timely manner, but also protecting the patient.
Yeah, and I would say that the way that we approach it is to really think about every situation as kind of a purpose-built use case and what are the requirements. So I'll give you an example, right? We know that risk adjustment, HEDIS, are very seasonal. There's work that the payer has to do after the fact to ensure that the data that they have can be coded and then submitted to CMS. So their turnaround time becomes very important. We got to make sure that that record gets out to our payers very quickly. So that's where speed matters. Got to get it out. There's a relationship between a payer and provider. They have BAA's agreement. So the concern about oversharing is probably a little bit less so. However, there's business considerations, there's privacy considerations, even through that process. So I'm constantly having to manage, okay, so the payer is desiring a 4-day turnaround time. However, I have to add a day for quality control because, God forbid, that one day, yes, it gives them one more day for coding. I have to still make sure that the data that they're getting is the right data. Because otherwise they'll think about rework and say, hey, you missed a signature on my risk adjustment. I have to have a signature. Things like those that ensure that not just that the data gets there on time, but that it gets there in the right way. Another example would be with continuity of care. We do a lot of continuity of care. We actually do it for free. People don't know this. Continuity of care, for the most part, you can't really charge it because it's about care for the patient. And so that's part of our service, we do it. With continuity of care, we have to give the data in the form that the provider requests. So unfortunately, when a doc, I think of the Cosby Show, I know it's not popular anymore, in the basement, the doctor is requesting a record, they fax. They want it in fax. We have to get it on fax. However, you want to make sure that even as that fax is going out, we're ensuring that that information goes to the right doctor. God forbid there's things like fraud, waste, and abuse. There's all kinds of things in healthcare. So all to say is we have these KPIs around turnaround time, around providing the data in the right format. However, we have to, like some of those ideal metrics, some of it we have to kind of sort of pull back and say, okay, I want to deliver this way to optimize the KPI. However, I also want to make sure that privacy is in the mix. So that might make me not meet my ideal KPI because I want to make sure that I'm doing everything in a compliant way.
Yeah. Well, and as you go, like you mentioned on quality, okay, we met the 4-day deadline, but if the quality is bad, you're going to spend 2 weeks dealing with the extra requests and rework that has to happen. So that makes a lot of sense. Mo, I love talking with you. I love learning from you and your organization. I mean, MRO obviously is deeply embedded in so many healthcare organizations, providing this important balance between access to the data and meeting those regulations and requirements, and but still protecting the privacy of the patient and also the organization. So thanks so much for helping educate us, and thanks everyone for watching and listening.
Always wonderful to be here with you, John.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And if you want to find more great healthcare IT content like this, be sure to check it out at healthcareittoday.com or search for Healthcare IT Today on your favorite podcast application. Thanks, Mo.
Thank you.